So we'll start with Professor Purvi Pokaria from Nirman University, who talk about the dialogic approach to criminal justice, from doing good to doing right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't be taking 25 minutes. I'll finish a little early, and I really would like to take your feedback, because the present paper, which is a working paper, and it is not yet complete. So there are so much of reading which is yet pending. So I really would like to talk on these issues further. The present working paper draft reflects on two major issues of critical criminal theory regime. The first is dialogical approach to criminal justice, which refers to legitimacy of procedural justice. So the fairness in procedure that establishes legitimacy and quality of fairness in decision-making process, in a sense that how one decides and choose between two sets of conflicting rights or the two competing interest groups. And these conflicting rights or interest groups have equality of valid claims, so that the decision makers must choose between value versus value rather than value versus devalue. Have to choose right versus right rather than right versus wrong, and interest versus interest. So this is the central theme of some of the thoughts which I would like to share with you today. So the origin of criminal justice appears tied to the systematic generation of social inequalities and the repression of powerless. The central concern for critical criminologists is the distribution of power and resources among social groups. Decision-making process dispensing criminal justice often must choose between, as I said, two sets of conflicting rights or two competing interest groups. The conflict between thesis and antithesis and individual rights in social policy create divergent perspective tugging in opposite direction. And this questions the legitimacy of the whole process of decision-making. Legitimacy is based on balancing the interest of observing fairness in the procedure. However, the dual and interactive character of legitimacy, which involves power holder and its audience, is often neglected. Legitimacy is always dialogic and relational in character, and it involves claims by power holders and responses of audience. And legitimacy is constantly in flux with the dialogical framework, and it is vital test for power holders to decide the case of rejection of claims of legitimacy. And if you look at the past few years, the question of legitimacy has become an increasingly important in recent past, and the reason is that it is important in achieving the law-abiding behavior and cooperation from the citizen. Legitimacy also refers here, as I discussed, the procedural justice, that is a quality of the decision-making process, and fairness in the way citizens are personally treated by the law enforcement officials. Legitimacy is dialogic, involving claims of legitimacy by power holders and responses, as I said, and that's the reason that the theoretical framework or theoretical approach to legitimacy is that of the procedural justice, based especially on the work of Tom Taylor. And he wrote his path-breaking book, Why People Obey the Law, and these are the sources which I intend to refer in my work. The Taylor began his seminal work by contrasting instrumental and normative modes of obedience to law. And he then subdivided the normative mode into personal morality, that is, people's general set of beliefs as how they should act, and legitimacy, that is, people's perception as to whether law enforcement officials rightly have authority over them. And he conducted a lot of surveys, and surveys were conducted of the general population, asking questions about the recent context with the police or the courts, and the relationship and the reaction to such context, and their subsequent behavior. And finally, to quote the conclusion of his research, what he has concluded that people comply with the law not so much because they fear punishment, as because they feel that legal authorities are legitimate and that their actions are generally fair. Thus, his empirical results These empirical results led Teller to prioritize normative compliance over the instrumental compliances, and within the normative compliances to emphasize legitimacy. Taylor has summarized his main thesis in twofold. First, whether citizens are treated fairly when the law enforcement authorities make decisions about them. For example, by being allowed to have their say without interruptions or harassment prior to the decision being made, that is a quality of decision-making process. And secondly, whether law enforcement officials treat citizens with proper respect as human beings, each with his or her own needs of dignity, privacy, so on and so forth. That's what we call as the quality of treatment. And Taylor contends that procedural fairness, if present, is more likely to lead two things. First, the immediate decision acceptance, and second, the initial ascription of legitimacy to the law enforcement authority. And Taylor, in his subsequent work, that is Russell Sage Foundation volumes, identified three larger questions, which I have pointed out over here. What is legitimacy? Taylor, in his subsequent work, said the definition of legitimacy, the reasons legitimacy is important within a social system, and thirdly, what factors create and sustain legitimacy, that is, what forms of social organization or what dynamics of authority are reviewed by members of particular social groups as being appropriate and hence legitimate the exercise of authority. And in this regard, by responding all these three questions, Taylor followed the Zeldrick in characterizing authority as legitimate when people believe that the decisions made and rules enacted by the authority or the institutions are in some way right or proper and ought to be followed. This definition assumes that the concept of legitimacy principally focuses upon the reactions by the citizens to the decisions and rules made by an authority. We have another critique. Holmes, however, have approached the focusing on the right to rule, which is seen from the standpoint of both citizens and power holders. The question arises on whether a power holder is justified in claiming the right to hold power over the citizens, and thus the issue decisions and the rules that are being binding on them. In this regard, the work of Jean Marc, he commented that legitimacy is the recognition of the right to govern. In this regard, it tries to offer a solution to fundamental political problem, which consists in justifying simultaneously political power and obedience. This definition has three important features. First, it emphasizes the normative character of legitimacy, that is, legitimacy is to be found where there is a positive recognition by the citizens of the power holders' moral right to exercise that power. Secondly, the definition explicitly incorporates the view that discussions of legitimacy must embrace both those who exercise political power and those who are expected to obey. Thus, legitimacy is seen as a recognition of the right to govern with the structural bilateral relationship, and if successfully established, it is simultaneously justifies the actions of both power holders and the obedient subject. And thirdly, and by implication, legitimacy within this definition is seen as necessarily conditional or divisible. For example, this is something which we can take so many examples in the current context. For example, in a given context, most citizens might at first deadly recognize the power holder as having the right to rule. However, if in time it becomes clear that power holder is routinely using power to engage in corrupt practices, it is very likely that the public recognition of his or her right to rule will be gradually withdrawn. Now, the second question is that what factors create and sustain legitimacy? Taylor and his colleagues answer the questions by reference only to studies of what might be described as the audience legitimacy and the functions within ongoing dialogical relationship. Now, talking about the audience legitimacy, we have a work, the contribution of David Bitham is noteworthy. David Bitham and Jean Marc both each independently developed the same threefold conceptualization of the central components of legitimacy from the perspectives of audiences, and they analyzed the dimensions of legality, shared values and consent which are crucial to the study of legitimacy. And then they have given the criteria of legitimacy and the corresponding form of non-legitimate power. And there are three criteria. First, the conformity to rules, and on the other hand, the corresponding form of non-legitimate power is illegitimacy, that is a breach of rules. On this side, the criteria of legitimacy, justifiability of rules in terms of shared belief. And on the other side, there is an absence of belief, or there is a discrepancies between the rules and shared belief. The third criteria in terms of the legitimacy, the legitimation through express consent. And on the other side, delegitimation, that is the withdrawal of the consent or absence of consent. And for Jean-Marc, the consent is constitutive of legitimate authority. The identification of power with right endures so long as consent exists. If the consent be withdrawn, that is the sign of lack of political legitimacy. Now on the other side, Taylor expressed also about the power holder legitimacy. And again he relied on Jean-Marc, and according to Jean-Marc, legitimacy is described as justifying simultaneously political power and obedience, and he tried to cover power holder legitimacy in legitimacy itself. Here the contribution of Weber is also noteworthy, which I really don't want to bring forth. But Weber saw power holder legitimacy as a necessary precondition for successful audience legitimation. Now, in a democracy, power holders' self-belief in the legitimacy cannot be ultimate test of whether they are acting legitimately or not. Nevertheless, power holder legitimacy remains important for several reasons. First, power holders cannot and should not be expected to carry out daily work with reference only to the current public opinion, and in any case, so they cannot be subjected to immediate public scrutiny. In other words, a degree of self-separation by power holders is often both appropriate and necessary in exercising authority responsibly. Second, power holder legitimacy may be important for the stability and effectiveness of authority. Unless those who exercise power and are convinced that there is an adequate moral justification for their continuation in the office, they are unlikely to be effective. And thirdly, as previously suggested, power holder legitimacy can be regarded as a precondition for successful audience legitimacy. That is, it is necessary for power holders to cultivate belief in the moral rightness of their own legitimacy before making claims to others to be the legitimate rulers. And fourth, within what we have described as a dialogical framework, a vital element of analysis is to be legitimacy within the real-life criminal justice. And that context must be careful examination of the responses by power holders to audiences' perceptions of legitimacy deficit. And within the dialogical framework, legitimacy is constantly in flux. It is a significant test for power holders when it becomes clear that a relevant audience has rejected one or more aspects of the initial claim of legitimacy. And in such circumstances, the power holder must put forward a revised claim to legitimacy, which in turn might well require adjustment in their own understanding of their right to rule. And then it turned out to be legitimacy, how legitimacy can be a moral recognition. The question here is that if legitimacy depends simply on the moral standards of a given society, and if societies can invent for themselves any kind of a moral basis for the authority of a particular regime, then David Smith has pointed out over here, and he says that the authorities are legitimate if people generally believe that they ought to be obeyed. And a political system, though clearly evil, can still be legitimate. And here, Smith has given a very concrete but hypothetical example which we can relate to the many examples of the recent Indian current democratic setup and governance. He gave an example that suppose if in a given state there is an ethnic minority population constituting of 1% of the population in the parliament of that state passes with a massive and enthusiastic support from the majority population, a statute saying that the minority is to be eliminated in death camps, then it would seem that according to the law and the shared values of the society, this enactment must on this kind of an analysis be regarded as a legitimate enactment. Now, how we look at legitimacy as a dialogue, as discussed earlier, when one has to choose between two competing interests, it is very crucial how legitimacy can be established through dialogical approach to criminal justice. And when faced with mutually opposing claims, It is a very well-known quote of Benjamin Cardozo. He said, when we are faced with the mutually opposing claims, judges must balance, philosophers synthesize, and politicians compromise. So conflict between thesis and antithesis and individual rights and social policies or competing interest groups create a demand for solutions of divergent perspectives tugging in opposite directions. And Cardozo, and it again he quoted that at its best, he said, if life feels the tug of these opposing tendencies, so also must the law, which is to prescribe the rule of life. And the dichotomies and dualities exist in legal language with reference to this, how we are going to take up a stand, getting into the dialogical process. So the dichotomies and dualities exist in legal language because they represent opposing values and concepts which lead to opposing principles. And he said, understanding the pursuit of law and justice is not possible without the first understanding the function of dichotomies or polarities. Our neural systems seem better adapted to the binary program of yes or no responses than to the response of yes. But learning the law is not merely learning principles in phase. We do not really know a principle until we know its opposing principle. So in this process, when we are taking a stand between two competing interests, how you are involving a dialogical process, giving the fair treatment in the decision-making process is very important. So lastly, I have a lot of questions, and the question that arises over here is as to, can we establish legitimacy through dialogical approach, taking criminal justice from doing good to doing right, that is from utilitarian to deontology, or from medical model to justice model? Now, the medical model here refers to the approach to criminal justice wherein the punishment is fit to offender rather than fitting to the offense, unlike the justice model. So there are questions that can be established dialogical process in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we move now to Ms. Pragya Mishra, who's going to present on her paper From Victiveness to Vipassana, a mindful approach to rehabilitative sentencing.
Very good afternoon to all present. I am probably the youngest person in the room, both in terms of age as well as academic qualifications. So I'm more here to use it as a learning opportunity than to share something. I'm a doctoral student over here. My topic is, the thesis title is on law and emotions, and rehabilitative sentencing is one of the working models which I'm expressing in my thesis. So broadly, I'll be covering these areas: emotionalization of criminal law, neurobiology as a genesis of criminal behavior, how this can be remedied by neuroplasticity, and the linkages between neurogenesis and mindfulness, and how mindfulness can be used as a rehabilitative form of sentencing, and it can overall herald a new norm of therapeutic jurisprudence. At the very outset, I would like to begin with two cases of US jurisprudence which have been quoted by Professor Adrian Ryan, who is a chair professor of Department of Criminology and Psychiatry in the University of Pennsylvania. In his book Anatomy of Violence, he takes the example of Herbert Weinstein versus State of Alabama. Herbert Weinstein was evidently a 65-year-old, very peaceful, law-abiding citizen who right at the age of, who up till this the case was filed, led a very peaceful, law-abiding life. However, just 6 months prior to the filing of this incident, over the Christmas holidays, he suffered a minor disagreement with his wife. And in the course of it, he was excited to such a murderous rage that he murdered her by repeatedly smashing her head upon the opposite wall. Not only that, he then went to the top terrace of the apartment and threw her over there and tried to plan an escape from the fire escape. Fortunately or unfortunately, he was apprehended by the police force and he was sentenced to death penalty, which was later overturned to life without parole. However, when Professor Adrian Ryan, who is a neurocriminal-biologist, went on to undertake this research, he tried to scan the brains of all the different categories of murders involved, and he came to this, and he realized this conclusion that immediately before this incident, Herbert Weinstein, the defendant, had developed a tumor over his prefrontal cortex, which was actually pressing down upon him. The second case he has discussed is that of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage is an individual who had a repeated violent criminal history. And at the age of 24, he committed his most heinous crime of his entire criminal career, which was to murder and brutally rape Peyton Hill, a sophomore college student, a very young, dynamic girl. And the way he describes that murder, he says that when she tries to struggle, when she tries to break free from his shackles, that noise of crying disturbed him to such an extent that he took a knife and he slit her throat. And the forensic expert which was present on the scene of crime says that I have seen animals in the slaughterhouse killed with much more decency. Now, when Dr. Ryan went on to analyze the brain scan of Phineas Gage and also went on to study his background history, he realized that his prefrontal cortex just before the incident was damaged by an iron rod. He was involved in a bar fight where he was hit by an iron rod and his prefrontal cortex was damaged. In terms of family history, he was the product of a teen pregnancy. His father abandoned him at the age of 2. His mother himself suffered from a mental disorder and suffered into repeated physical beatings. He was raped at the age of 4. He suffered severe childhood depression ever since the age of 6. And every time as a baby, this was something which was reported by one of the social workers, that he has been transferred from one foster home to another, because what his mother used to do was that every time as a baby used to cry, she used to shake him. That somehow again, according to Professor Adrian, resulted in a disturbance of neurochemistry. However, at the end of this trial, what Phineas Gage says is that nobody cared about me until I hurt someone. All you see right now is a black man who has raped and murdered a white woman. But at every stage of my life, I have tried to appeal to the state for help. And at every stage of the trial, the only question which the jury and the entire judicial system asked is who rather than why. I am 24 years old. I never had a chance to live, and now it's over. Why both cases are important is that, as we rightly discussed in yesterday's sessions, retributive anger does have a place in the criminal jurisprudence. It does, anger in itself is a quintessentially judicial phenomena. But when you analyze both these cases from the prism of biological origins of crime, we invariably end up with the question that in these cases, does retribution serve just results? Another question which of course has been very widespread across most of the neuroscientists which I've read about is that as human beings, emotions are as ubiquitous to law as they are to life. And at some or the other extent, we are all prisoners imprisoned by the baser traits of our own minds. Anger, fear, desire is something which is present in varying degrees in all of us. And who amongst us has never thought of hurting the person who hurt us first? Who amongst us has never thought of has actually had a thought of vindication or revenge? The only thin line of difference which separates us from these convicts is that we had a better functioning, a better lid upon this Pandora's box of negative emotions. Inside our head, it can be argued to some extent we are all potential criminals. So criminal law, though reluctantly acknowledges that emotions can distort thinking, disable control, fuel motive and drive action, it gives it a scant standing in its account of culpability. What criminal law actually is concerned about is actus reus or objective act and the mens rea or the subjective intention, which must conjoin at the moment of the culpability so as to render a guilty verdict. This has somehow resulted in the present day sentencing mechanism to become a more dispassionate and detached intellectual exercise. However, on the other hand, no matter how uneasy the relationship between law and emotions, we cannot deny that emotional aspect does seep into the criminal justice system. Anger, disgust, shame are all valuable barometers. And criminal law, though acknowledges our human frailty, when it lessens our culpability, by giving us defenses like grave and sudden provocation when we are excited to sudden rage, and also punishing us for disgustful anger, which results in hate crime. However, in the whole statutory philosophy of criminal law, there is no, even though there is an inherent belief that an internalized locus of self-control should exist within one's own psyche, there is no corrective mechanism to bring about that change in the offender. Another thing which I think we have, I will just skip over it because it has been discussed much in the yesterday's session, was that how proportional payback doesn't actually balance out the offense, and anger is fundamentally flawed. It's rooted in the human weakness and ultimately harmful. Of course, the major authority on it is Nassbaum. However, we cannot also, we cannot also completely relegate her work into the background, because overcoming of anger is something which has been actively practiced in South Africa in the establishment of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The whole mandate of these commissions was to bring about the kind of a systemic change which she talks about in her work, from anger to reparation and rehabilitation. And they openly granted amnesty and forgiveness to very grave violators of human rights who had committed the crimes of apartheid. So, Durkheim also has talked about how we need to overhaul our retributive and revenge-based justice system to a more restitutive justice system, which is to be found in a more evolved and a more civilized forms of society. Another aspect is that retributivism also somehow brings in the element of recidivism. There have been repeated studies conducted by Clinton Hall of University of New Mexico, which talk about how 30% of the offenders actually go on to repeat the offenders once they are released from the prison. And the Hard Jail, India's largest prison, has acutely been suffering from various accounts of recidivism. Another reason behind doing away with retribution is that even if we don't go on to the extent of executing an offender, even the concept of incarceration somehow adds on to the additional burden on the state's financial resources, especially in an underdeveloped country like India, where 13,000 out of the 13,000 inmates of Tihar jail, 9,000 are still under trial prisoners. So these are some questions. And somehow Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of separating the man from his deed and of hating the sin and not the sinner does provide a certain kind of solution towards it. Neurocriminology, like I said, is another step towards expressing the highest values of our civilization. It works on the basic notion that crime is only partially a social and environmental phenomena, and biological factors also play a somewhat determining role. Of course, Cecil Longduni, who was the founder of this whole chain of thought, has been widely discredited, but the recent work by Professor Adrian is something of much more of a refreshing and revolutionizing dimensions. What Professor Adrian says is that he first goes on to explain the importance of prefrontal cortex in the human brain. Man is the only primate in the chain of evaluation who is blessed with a prefrontal cortex, and it is often referred to as our new brain or our thinking brain, as compared to the animal brain, because it acts as a guardian angel, as a sort of a, like I said, as a sort of a lid on our Pandora's box of negative emotions. It keeps all our aggressive tendencies and volatile behaviors under check. It acts as a controlling mechanism for anger and aggression. Now, what happens when a human being is subjected under severe stress? The flow of information from the prefrontal cortex to the motor cortex is virtually cut off. What that means is that we somehow relegate back to our basic primal animalistic instincts. We go back into the role of pure animalistic passion and mindless violence, which can be seen in the deeds of serial killers and psychopaths. Physical injuries, he claims, that are another important factor, according to his research, which figured in violent and aggressive criminal behavior. 70% of serial killers received extensive head injuries as children or adolescents. And he said, then he went on to, he took separate category of offenders, and he went on to compare their brain scans. So this is what a normal brain scan looks like as compared to the brain scan of a murderer. So we can clearly see that there is a very, very decreased activity in the area of the prefrontal cortex. The red area shows that it's almost not functioning at all. However, not all offenders fit one profile. Serial killers, he said, tend to have a very good functioning in the prefrontal cortex, which actually helps them to evade detection. and go on to executively plan their crime in a more organized manner and go on a killing spree. Psychopaths, he contends, have 18% smaller amygdala as well as a lower functioning, again, a lower number of neurons and grey matter in the prefrontal cortex area. Also, he says that when psychopaths are shown images of an emotional nature, generally which are kind to trigger some kind of a sentimental response in normal human beings, the parts of the brain which would actually be activated in any other person remains visibly unclouded. This is a startling discovery given the fact that 1% of all human population is psychopath and 15 to 25% of all prisoners in jails are psychopaths. Another important finding is the concept of mirror neurons. What are mirror neurons? Mirror neurons are those which actually help us to reflect, as the very name suggests, to reflect or to imbibe the emotions in other individual. So these are brain cells which are actually responsible for triggering in us the emotions of empathy, compassion and forgiveness. Mirror neurons are also, when normally we see someone in pain, we empathize because these mirror neurons are triggered and activated, and which helps us to understand another person's pain, which again acts somehow as a regulator upon our violent tendencies. But here again, the psychopath's brain shows that even at a fetal level, the very basic and rudimentary structure of mirror neurons is entirely absent in their brains. So now this research actually raises some important questions, that does this somehow lead us back to the bad old days of Nazi eugenics? And doesn't it completely erode the concept of free will? Because on the one hand, we are saying that these individuals cannot help themselves. They have a genetic and a biological predisposition towards crime. On the other hand, we are also saying we also don't want to completely absolve the concept of human agency, because that in itself would lead us to a world which would completely destroy our fundamental human rights. The basic one of all is the right to live. The answer to all these questions, that is the concept of free will completely non-existent in the light of all this research, is a resounding no when we account for another recent and fascinating discovery of neuroscience, which is called neuroplasticity. The basic concept of neuroplasticity is that human brain is a very malleable, adaptable and a plastic structure. It is the only organ of the human body which keeps generating and regenerating itself right until after puberty, right into the last stages of our life. Our brains are malleable, they are constantly being reshaped by our new experiences and our thoughts. And the trillions of neural networks which are composed, which the brain is composed of, every time we practice a new behavior or we feel a new emotion, they form a separate set of pathway within them. And the more we repeatedly perform a task, more the number of iterations, the more strengthened those pathways get. So with every iteration, it becomes easier and easier for our brain to learn those specific sets of behavior. So this concept has been discussed by Dr. Rick Hansen in his book Rewiring Happiness, where he says that emotions, like every other skill in this world, are educable. Just like playing a piano or learning a new language, you can actually teach emotions of empathy, forgiveness and mercy even to the most deplorable and so-called marginalized sections of society. The whole concept is based on Galileo's, the famous astronomer's concept of localization, which says that specific brain areas have specific functions, and like I explained a while ago, prefrontal cortex is a basis for executive planning and decision making. Amygdala controls our flight and fight responses. Auditory cortex, Weimark's area and cingulate gyrus are again responsible for certain kind of moral decision making. And at the juncture of all these neurons, there is this structure called the synapse. Synapse is that brief temporary zone between two new neurons, where the triggering of the flow of information occurs. So Donald O. Hebb, who was a professor at McGill University, he gave this famous slogan that neurons that fire together wire together, and neurons that fall out of sync fail to link. What this means is that if two nearby neurons are often transmit information, the flow of information at the same time, they produce an impulse in their close temporal proximity. in such a way that their functional properties actually start getting converged. In plain and simple English, we could say that they somehow get binded or stitched together. And this, he said, is the crux behind all important traits of a human being's personality. All our emotions, all our habit patterns, all our even our memory and the way we perceive our past and the future is dependent upon this simultaneously activated neural activity. Also, he said that this process of neurogenesis often results in okay, there's a short no, it's not working. Okay. There was a short presentation over here of how this happens. So yeah, he said that the process of neurogenesis, it again gives great insight into the criminal behavior, because this further supplements Professor Adrian Ryan's research that right before a very violent and heinous act has been happened, some kind of new neural pathways have been observed on the criminal's brain. Now we move on to this question that how much is it within our control to reshape and rewire these neural pathways? Like genetics, is it something which actually happens all on its own, or is it something which in which we have a role to play? Now, Dr. Rick Hansen says 3 basic facts about the human brain. Firstly, he says that as the brain changes, the mind changes. What this means in simple terms is that when an individual is subjected to chronic stress, the hippocampus gradually shrinks and the amygdala expands, which results in the release and secretion of a stress hormone called cortisol, which somehow actually keeps on degrading the hippocampus, which is a center for visual and spatial memory. Second basic postulate of his theory is that as the mind changes, the brain changes, which means that immaterial mental activity maps to material neural activity. There have been numerous studies which show that how practicing gratitude, kindness, and acts of charitable and spiritual notions can actually enhance the serotonin reuptake in our brain. It leads to greater feelings of happiness and well-being. Release norepinephrine, which is a natural opioid which is produced by the body, which enhances our feelings of learning and creativity. So what flows through the brain, what flows through the mind actually sculpts the brain. And combining these two things, he comes up with the basic notion of neuroplasticity, which is that to train your mind, to train your brain, to train your mind to lead a better life. That sounds a bit of a tongue twister, but what it actually means is that at any given stage of life, with adequate amount of self-awareness and self-focus, we can actually retrace our new neural pathways. This is where the concept of mindfulness comes in, because the key to whole mindfulness is to have a heightened sense of awareness towards our own response to various external stimuli. It's a technique which helps us to manage our emotional regulations more effectively. And Dr. Richard Hansen's research says that even 30 minutes of meditation per day can increase the gray matter or the cortical thickness of anterior cingulate gyrus, can result in the increase of gray matter area of prefrontal cortex, and can actually increase the length of the hippocampus. Not only this, it decreases the size of amygdala and diminishes the working of our default mode network, which is more commonly referred to as a monkey mind, that part of our mind which keeps oscillating between the present and between the past and the future. These are specific brain scan studies again, which shows that how after even 30 minutes of meditation, these existing gaps between the neural pathways are filled in, and this leads to strengthening of the neural networks. This becomes very important in the context of evolving a new form of mindfulness-based rehabilitative sentencing, and this is where prison Vipassana camps come into the picture. Prison Vipassana camps were first introduced by Dr. Kiran Bedi, who is India's first woman IPS officer in Tihar jail, and she was with an astonishing success. It led to the criminals having a more regulated and a more it led to loss of criminal recidivism. It led them to have a more internalized locus of self-control, and it furthered their rehabilitation goals, which is basically to help the prisoners cope better with environmental stressors and equip them with the tools to explore more meaningful goals. Now, similar attempts were then inspired by Donaldson Prison in USA, which is the maximum high security prison. The prison inmates over here actually go for life, and an Alabama North Rehabilitation Facility in Seattle. And the impact of both these prison Vipassana projects were explored by NIMHANS, which is National Institute of Mindfulness and Neuroscience, as well as National Institute of Mental Health, and a Massachusetts-based institute called the Prison Mindfulness Institute. What all these three different researchers point out is that meditation helped the prisoners to cope better with their environmental stressors. It helped them. It led to a reduced tendency of aggression, stress, and addiction. It helped them to confront their feelings of remorse and guilt. And more than 61% of the prisoners actually reported that they repented for the first time in their life. They had a full-fledged realization and a sense of repentance about the kind of injury they had inflicted upon their fellow human beings. And some of them even went on to make reconciliatory attempts to the families of the victims and took a genuine pledge of never to repeat. Also, a recidivism study was conducted which went on to highlight that yes, the prisoners who had attended these courses, rarely, not even 1% of them actually were habitual offenders, went on to become habitual offenders. So, in the light of all these studies, I would like to contend that ultimately we need to, somewhere law needs to incorporate all these findings of neuroscience and mindfulness to usher a new tone of therapeutic jurisprudence. Because ultimately, like the famous saying of India, Raman Maharshi says that self-reform automatically brings about social reform. And this is what is the basic concept of Vipassana. Vipassana says that it is made from two Pali words, Vi plus Vipassana, which means a special type of insight. It promotes a spirit of non-judgmental self-awareness, and by increasingly encouraging one to focus upon the various bodily sensations and the subtle nuances of one's thought, it encourages more focus upon one's baser and more nuanced thought level. And Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer has again been a long and ardent supporter of a reformative philosophy and a rehabilitative strategy. So on this note, I would like to say that it is the duty of the criminal justice punishment to actually bring criminal justice administration to actually facilitate such kind of a self-reform mechanism, because ultimately the journey of self-reform has to be taken by none but the prisoner himself. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now we move on to Professor Alan Norrie, who talked to us about criminal justice, law, thinking, and critical relation.
Thanks very much, Enrique. The title of the paper that you got in the pack is slightly different from the one that's on, well, it's different from the one that's on the programme. The title in the pack is Can We Flourish Without Addressing the Past? But I think probably what happened was that I wanted to think about what would be a topic for this session, and criminal justice, love, thinking, critical relation would have been one. But actually the paper that I'm talking to addresses that title, but through its own title and through its own argument, which is this idea of flourishing without addressing the past. So the paper is about criminal justice and love, and thinking through the critical relation by thinking about issues of flourishing and forgiveness and love in a particular setting and in relation to a particular dialogue. So let me just begin by saying something about the overall concerns of the paper and how it's set up. So its overall concerns. Its overall concern is, well, I've been thinking and interested for a time in the issue of transitions from states of trauma in the so-called sphere of transitional justice. The ways in which, in different settings, throughout the world, of course the famous one is South Africa, but we can think also of contexts like Colombia and Chile, and in the UK we have the north of Ireland, situations where we have societies that have gone through really traumatic phases, and they are in some way or another changing, transiting from them. And my question really was, well, in that kind of setting, which is a different kind of setting from your standard municipal or national criminal justice setting. What kind of role do issues of guilt, forgiveness, responsibility, what kind of role do those play in this very different setting? Because I've spent a lot of time thinking about national criminal justice systems, a formal system of law, and that, I think that takes you in certain directions, but I wanted to look at something different where in a way one thing that happens in these settings is that there's a bit of an inversion really, in that often it is the state that is the criminal, and it is the victim is the state is the perpetrator, and the victim is someone who has experienced trauma at the hands of the state. And in that kind of setting, I think it's quite interesting to think about issues of trauma and forgiveness, and the sense of pain that is and violation that is in crime in a different way than in a normal criminal justice system. The main thought is that you can't get away from thinking about violation in these settings, and violations have to be dealt with. They can't just be brushed under the carpet or swept aside in favour of a transition to a supposedly better condition, social and political condition. And the example that I take in this paper is an example from the UK, which is the example of a woman called Jo Berry. Jo Berry was the daughter of a Conservative government minister in the Thatcher government, Sir Anthony Berry, and he was blown up. He was killed in the IRA set a bomb in 1984 to blow up Mrs. Thatcher, and they didn't succeed in killing her, but they did kill a number of people, and one of them was Sir Anthony Berry. Now the thing about this was that after his death, Jo Berry decided somehow that the only way that she could deal with what had happened to her as the victim of this bombing was if she could in some way turn it to a positive effect. And Pat McGee was one of the bombers, and he was caught and he was sent to prison for a number of years. And when he got out in the late 90s, Jo Berry made contact with him, and they developed quite a close dialogic, to use that word, relationship, which is the sort of the ultimate focus of this paper. And what I was really trying to do in thinking about Jo Berry and Pat McGee was I was trying to think, well, how do they actually address these issues of responsibility and blame and guilt and forgiveness in a really very practical and emotional context of how they've come together. Now, the thing about it was, and so the three parts of the paper, let me just say what the three parts of the paper are. And the three parts of the paper are, the first part is where I explain where I'm coming from on this, and this is early-ish work in thinking through these issues. But I've been working on it in a variety of ways. I've been thinking about guilt and love, as I said yesterday, and also thinking about psychoanalysis. So I'm trying to find a way of putting these things together, and that's what the first part of the paper does. And then the second part of the paper takes the recent book by Martha Nassbaum that we've mentioned on a couple of occasions these last 2 days. Martha Nassbaum's book on anger and forgiveness. And she has this notion of the need for, in a way she downplays anger, as Latika was saying yesterday. She downplays anger. She doesn't say it doesn't happen, but it should be a trigger to what she calls the transition. And the transition is with a capital T, the transition. And the whole panoply of guilt, responsibility, forgiveness she sees that as being really not the way to go. That what we need to do, we need to look to have a better world, either in utilitarian or welfare terms. We need the world to be a better place, and we ought not to let the past get in the way of that. So all those kinds of things that the law has, like guilt, like punishment, responsibility, all these things are what she calls transactional. And she contrasts transitions with transactions. And she says that she's in favour of transitions, the transition, but the transactions are not so important. They're and can be quite problematic. And what I'm trying to do in this paper is to say that if we're going to have transitions, then we can't have them without transactions. So we can't have transitions, we can't make the world better without dealing transactionally with the past. And so the two need to go together. When we come to look at Joe Berry and Pat McGee and what they have to say about their relationship, it looks to begin with like Martha Nussbaum's got it right and I've got it wrong, because Joe Berry's initial thoughts are along the lines of, well, you know, it's not an issue of forgiveness of any kind, it's an issue of unconditional love. And that's important. It's only once we express unconditional love that we can move forward. And that's really Martha Nussbaum's point, because she says that, you know, what underlies transition is a sense of, we just have to forgive and forget. More than forgiving, we have to really give up on forgiving in favour of a metaphysical status of unconditional love. Now, in my paper, I've got unconditional love there, but I want to see that as related to action in the world, in the sense that unconditional love must be linked to unconditional forgiveness, but then also linked to conditional forgiveness, so that the transactions that we participate in are related to the possibility of the transitions that will then occur. That's roughly the flow of the argument. So let me begin by saying something about how I've come to where I've got to. And this sort of recapitulates something what I said at the very end of my talk yesterday morning. So basically, I start with the idea of guilt, and some of you will have heard me talk about the idea of metaphysical guilt before. It's an idea that I pick up from Primo Levi, but in philosophical terms from Karl Jaspers, who wrote about metaphysical guilt in the wake of the Second World War. And Levi's very, very fascinating, I think, because in a way what Jaspers saw as being a crucial element in thinking about the idea of guilt philosophically, Levi just felt experientially. It came to Levi experientially. You know, he explains in The Drowned and the Saved, one of his books that came out of his experience in the war, in the concentration camps. He explains there how he experienced this sense of guilt, which in terms very similar to Jaspers had expressed philosophically. So Jaspers talks about a lack of absolute solidarity with the human being as such. So an idea of absolute solidarity with the human being as such. An indelible claim beyond morally meaningful duty. So we've got morally meaningful duty, we've got a deeper level, which is a level of absolute solidarity with the human being. Somewhere among men that the unconditional prevails, the capacity to live only together or not at all. And Levi said something similar. He talked about the demand for solidarity, for a human word, advice, even only a listening ear. And that demand for solidarity was permanent and universal, but rarely satisfied. In the camps, people cried out for solidarity, but it was always there, the cry, but it was rarely heard. And this was the source of the survivor's guilt. Now, so what I was trying to think about was, in a way, that this idea of a world that's beyond ethics, you know, a world in which, you know, to take a description from the Rwandan genocide, David Cesarani describes thinking about that as where every man becomes a genocidal killer. You know, it's a world where there is no ethical hope whatsoever. And what I was trying to do in drawing upon, and this in a way replicates something that Hannah Arendt had said around the problem of German war guilt, around the problem of Adolf Eichmann. So what I was trying to get at was some way of understanding why there might still be a place for guilt in a world that seemed to exist and operate on premises that lacked any sense of morality. And you needed to go to a deeper level, to the metaphysical level, to get to that, I felt. And I felt that Jaspers gave me that inroad, and it was kind of justified or grounded in the real experience of Primo Levi in the camp. So it's a meta-reality, if you like, in terms of the critical realist language. It's a meta-reality, but it's a reality that's grounded in the world, in experience in the world. That then leads me on to the idea of love, which is linked to this. And I've recently worked on the idea of love, developing what it means to love. It's an extended review of a book by a man called Christian Smith, called To Flourish or Destruct. And I look there at love in two ways. One way is just that kind of, is linked to the idea of metaphysical guilt. It's the idea of, this links again with the idea of meta-reality. It's the idea of an unconditional love, a form of love that spreads out from love of self to love of another, to love of all human beings in the world, to love of the species, to love of all other species, and to love as the source or sustaining power in creation itself, and to which we often attach the name God, but I don't think you need to attach the name God to it. You could have a godless sense of love in this sense of a universal love in the world. And I link that idea, that sort of Bhaskarian idea, up with the idea of a metaphysics of guilt. Because if you like, the metaphysics of guilt is when we fall short in terms of the metaphysics of love. We feel guilt precisely because we refuse the claim of the other. We refuse the request for solidarity with the other. So that's one route into thinking about that, one link to love. And the other route to love is the psychoanalytic route. And here I draw on the philosophy of Jonathan Lear, and Jessica Benjamin, and also Melanie Klein, to think about love as the libidinous drive and the emotional relation that gets us going as people, and that provides us with the gift of our individuation, ultimately provides us with the gift of our individuation and personhood through loving recognition by another. And that's a story that starts with the depressive phase in Melanie Klein's analysis that Craig spoke about yesterday, but also takes me into Jessica Benjamin's feminist psychoanalysis from the 1980s. Now I think the thought is that these things all can go together, but I want to develop that second aspect. We've got the sense of a metaphysical guilt at one level, and we've got the sense of a kind of a human level of love, and I need to think about at the human level, at the psychoanalytic level of love, how that comes out of guilt as well. But like I said yesterday, the analogy, the metaphor would be with the grain of sand, the universe that is in the grain of sand, and so this unique and small, but ultimately very large connection that the infant, the child, the baby has with its parent is, in a sense, at the core of the universal sense of love. They're the micro and the macro of the same thing. But I need to say a little bit more about guilt coming out of the psychoanalytic analysis. And in that I start with Melanie Klein, and the basic argument that in the primary narcissistic phase, there's an intense anger that the infant feels and expresses when things aren't going well. The infant is hungry, uncomfortable, and it translates that into a fear. It translates that, so it has this narcissistic anger, which, so there's love, there's the sense of well-being and love, and then there's anger, and these things are not at all in phase with each other, and there's a fear. The narcissistic fear is that through the anger one will have damaged the thing that one is angry about, i.e. the parent, and yet the parent is the object that is loved. So there's a tremendous kind of conflict in the baby, which comes out in Klein's analysis as an anxiety that you've hurt the thing that you love, and that guilt is really the conflict, and it is a conflict and a tension between what we would deeply wish for an object of our love, and a fear that we may have damaged that object. So that's the starting point. There's some kind of sense of guilt within us in our most basic dealings with the world. Now, I use Jessica Benjamin's work to expand on that, to sort of give it a bit more of a framing that could allow us to think about how we might think about guilt in our relationships with other people and not in the parent-child bond. I mean, Benjamin's work is, I think, fascinating, and in a way, she has a way, I think, of resolving the Hegel's dialectic of recognition in a way that's potentially much more satisfactory than that unsatisfactory conclusion to the master-slave dialectic in Hegel's phenomenology. And her idea there is that she draws upon the master-slave relation, but she says that recognition that in good parenting there is a successful individuation of the parent from the child and the child from the parent. There's a successful, and that individuation of the child is a successful recognition. And of course that's where things go well, because things can go badly in the parent-child relationship. But where they go well, there is successful recognition, and there's successful individuation of the child. And that creates a kind of tensed space between the two, such that the parent's recognition of the child as another person gives that child the space to be itself, and it invokes in the child a counter recognition that the parent too is an individual. So only if the parent is herself accepted as an individual can her recognition of the child enable it to act independently as an individual in its own right. But there's a tension there. There's a constant need to monitor that, and it can go very badly wrong. So the parent can become dominant, or in the case of His Majesty the baby, the child can become dominant. Either the parent or child can become dominant, and that can really affect things there. So there's a play of recognition, and essentially what I suggest is that play of recognition is then the thing that one can think of as being the thing that lies behind feelings of guilt that one might have in relation to things done to other people in the world, and not just in the parent-child relationship. So the starting point there with thinking about guilt, and then I want to. So I've given some kind of ethical foundation for guilt in both a metaphysical and a psychoanalytic context, and as a real experience. Now that then takes me on to Nassbaum's work, I think I'm probably going to slightly more than 5 minutes. Is that okay? I'll try and be as quick as I can.
Still confirms 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So, as I said, with Nassbaum, so Nassbaum's work is about forgiveness rather than guilt, but guilt and forgiveness are really part of the same setting, if you like, because in the ways in which we think about this, if you have guilt, then one of the ways of avoiding guilt is through forgiveness. But Nassbaum says, well, I don't want to go down that route. I don't want to talk about guilt and forgiveness and all that stuff, because that's really what she calls conditional forgiveness. You know, because you've done this, I'll do that. And she says that that's ultimately that's kind of punishing. It's not really forgiving. It's in a sense latently punishing. And she gives the example of the parable of the son, the prodigal. That was the word I was thinking for. Thanks. She gives the parable of the prodigal son, who comes home, and the father goes out and embraces the son, and won't hear any kind of request for forgiveness from him. It's enough that he's come home. And she says that's the way in which the world should be. That's the model that's the model for the transition, that we should have a sense of unconditional love. Anger should simply be a sign for a transition to a setting of unconditional love and transition to a better world, and give up on all these thoughts of culpability and blame, leading to responsibility and forgiveness and so on, and guilt. Now I think that to me is too short. It seems to me that you know, just to take the example of the prodigal son, you know, it seems to me that any parent in that setting would not really be truly loving their child if they didn't say to them that, well, you know, you're very welcome back here, but I have to say that what you've done is not really right. You know, you shouldn't really have done what you did, and it behoves me as your parent to say that to you. And by the way, I think that any parent who is behaving badly towards a child is equally entitled to be addressed in that way. And that has nothing to do with there not being a setting of unconditional love, but rather that love and dialogue should, in these settings, be together rather than apart. So you need a transaction as well as a transition. You need a transaction as well as unconditional love. And that brings me on to the final part, and I'll just try and wrap this up in 2 or 3 minutes. It's Joe Berry and Patrick McGee. So now here's something that she says. She says that, this is talking about McGee. She says, an inner shift is required to hear the story of the enemy. For me, the question is always about whether I can let go of the need to blame and open my heart enough to hear Patrick's story and understand his emotions. The truth is, sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. Now I don't talk about forgiveness. To say I forgive you is almost condescending. It locks you into an us and them scenario, keeping me right and you wrong. This is essentially Nassbaum's point. But I can experience empathy, and in that moment there's no judgment. Sometimes when I've met with Patrick, I've had such a clear understanding of his life that there's nothing to forgive. I wanted to meet Patrick to put a face to the enemy and to see him as a real human being. I feel I've been recovering some of the humanity I lost when that bomb went off. I've realised that no matter which side of the conflict you're on, had we all lived each other's lives, we could all have done what the other did. I could easily have made the same choices Patrick made. Now, if I were Martha Nussbaum, I would be saying, oh, this completely makes my point for me. But of course, it's not the point that I want to make. So I then need to think about, well, how do I reflect on that? And I think my answer is that it lies in the first 3 lines of what she says. She says, an inner shift is required to hear the story of the enemy. For me, the question is always about whether I can let go of the need to blame and open my heart enough to hear Patrick's story and understand his motivations. the truth is that sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. Now, from Nassbaum's point of view, she might say, well, you know, the problem, Jo's problem is that she hasn't got properly to the transition yet. She should let go of that. But my sort of counter-argument to that would be, well, no, that should be exactly where she's at. She should be in a place where she feels all sorts of conflicted emotions about this man, many of which will be based around needs to blame, to hold responsible, to find culpable, and so on, as well as that other side, which is the universal side in her, which is very powerful. But why should that be the only side? And especially when you hear what Patrick McGee has to say in relation to his conversations with her. And this is my last point. So he says, McGee's position is this. He says, someday I may be able to forgive myself, although I still stand by my actions, because at the time we were trapped and there was no other way. I will always carry the burden that I harmed other human beings, but I'm not seeking forgiveness. If Jo could just understand why someone like me could get involved in the armed struggle, then something has been achieved. Between Jo and me, the big issue is the use of violence. I can't claim to have renounced violence. Now, you know, he's in a very split position. You know, he's saying what I did was justified in the situation of the Irish struggle for against the Ulster state. You know, we were entitled to take to arms, but I feel really bad about it. You know, that's what he's saying. So he's not saying what I did was wrong. So he's saying I'm not asking for forgiveness. At the same time as he's saying, at some point I may be able to forgive myself. So I'm not looking for forgiveness, and at some point there's a real conflict in what he's saying, in the message that he's giving. And I think in that setting, that's a dialogue, that's a broken dialogue. It's a broken dialogue between Jo and Pat. It's a dialogue that can't be transactional in the right kind of way, because he's not asking her for forgiveness. So the dialogue stops at one place. It's a dialogue of at one level, it's a dialogue of the morally deaf, and yet it's a dialogue that is of the morally good at the same time. And it's for that reason, I think, that one might think, you know, it might make a difference to her if he was asking for forgiveness. And until he does, then why shouldn't she feel that part of her just is angry and blaming for the things that she's experienced and suffered in this world, despite whatever her metaphysical and loving feelings may be. So that's my argument for saying, that's how I interpret that piece, as a way of saying that transitions are about transactions, and that unconditional love doesn't come alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yet another really wonderful panel. So the floor is open.